Is a quiet child problematic or just misunderstood? And when does distraction become something deeper? I'm Elliot Blackwell.
I'm Pandora, Kim.
You're listening to We Might Be Wrong Again. Today we're doing a deep dive into what autism spectrum disorder actually is. We have a massive stack of sources spanning evolutionary biology to modern psychiatry.
Yeah, and we are definitely coming at this from completely opposite sides of the biological fence. Because, I am looking at the data suggesting ASD is a natural targeted evolutionary advantage, like something that actively helped early humans survive.
Right, well, I plan to push back on that quite heavily, because when you look at the genomic realities, ASD looks much more like a biological trade-off. It's a steep, almost accidental price our species paid for rapidly evolving high intelligence.
But wait, calling it a price feels like, I don't know, we're dismissing the very traits that kept our ancestors alive. The evolutionary research on early hunter-gatherer societies paints a fundamentally different picture of human history.
I just struggle to see how an ancient group size of, say, 50 to 100 people dictates modern neurological conditions. I mean, let's unpack the actual biology first.
Sure, but you can't really decouple biology from the environment. In a tight-knit foraging group of that size, having a few individuals with highly specialized neurodiverse minds offered a massive collective advantage.
The genomic data from the recent studies paints this as a structural accident. The research focuses specifically on human L23IT neurons.
Right, those are the upper layer neurons responsible for complex, long-range communication across the cortex, correct?
They are, yes. And they evolved at a breakneck pace in humans compared to other apes, driving our rapid cognitive expansion. But that speed caused immense genetic instability.
I am not entirely convinced that rapid evolution implies an accident, though. I mean, nature usually selects for speed when the survival benefit is undeniable.
Well, let me point you to the Olduvai protein domain family. These are highly duplicated genomic sequences that literally acted as the biological scaling mechanism for the primate brain.
Yeah, they are the reason we have the cognitive capacity to build civilizations while other primates do not.
True. But copying those genomic sequences so rapidly introduces structural chaos. Our DNA essentially started mass-producing these brain-building blocks without a stable blueprint.
I still question the use of the word chaos when the end result was literally the survival of our species.
But building a brain that fast is rather like throwing up a skyscraper at double speed. You get a much taller building, but the foundation becomes extremely prone to cracking.
I'm not sure comparing neurodivergence to a cracked foundation is a fair assessment of human capability.
It is biologically accurate, though. Look at the 1q21 chromosome region, which is highly susceptible to copy number variations.
Meaning the genome accidentally duplicates or deletes sections of DNA during reproduction?
That is the core issue, yes. If those sequences duplicate in that specific area, it leads to macrocephaly, a physically larger brain in autism.
And if the region suffers a deletion?
A deletion in that exact same genetic neighborhood leads to schizophrenia. It is a biological tightrope walk, which makes framing autism simply as a targeted evolutionary superpower feel quite disconnected from the science.
Look, I hear the genomic instability argument. However, I hesitate to dismiss the resulting traits as mere byproducts of some evolutionary gamble.
How can you not? I mean, it's basically a biological wheel of fortune.
Because our ancestors thrived specifically because they had minds capable of deep systemic observation. The solitary forager hypothesis explains this perfectly.
I am highly skeptical of framing this as a targeted survival superpower.
Think about it practically. If your tribe is starving, having someone with the hyper-focus to track a single animal for days without distraction is what keeps everyone alive.
I suppose hyperfocus has utility, I'll grant you that.
Yeah.
But this neurodiversity light trend ignores the severe, debilitating genetic vulnerabilities some individuals face.
Oh, we absolutely cannot gloss over those real-world struggles. Some individuals face profound challenges with independent living and daily communication.
Which makes the evolutionary advantage argument feel rather disconnected from modern clinical realities.
It only feels disconnected because of the environmental mismatch. The disability primarily arises from taking a brain adapted for a specialized hunter-gatherer niche and, forcing it into our modern world.
Meaning the traits aren't inherently broken, but the current environment makes them debilitating.
Exactly. Like, imagine having exceptional sensory perception on the Paleolithic savanna. Hearing a twig snap a mile away keeps you from being eaten.
But take that same unfiltered sensory perception and drop it into a loud, chaotic, fluorescent-lit modern office.
The person becomes completely overwhelmed. The trait hasn't changed. The environment simply stopped valuing it.
That mismatch has massive implications for how we judge behavior today, especially in educational settings.
It really does. It means we need to completely reframe what teachers routinely punish as bad behavior. The empathizing systemizing theory provides a brilliant lens here.
Let's dig into that. You were talking about the behaviors often written off as uh, stubbornness or obsessive routines.
Right. The theory argues that what looks like rigid stubbornness is actually a hypersystemizing. An autistic child often needs variables to remain completely constant to grasp the complex rules of their environment.
Like needing to eat the exact same breakfast every day or meticulously lining up toy cars by color.
Yeah, think of a scientist trying to understand a chemical reaction. They hold everything constant and only change one variable at a time.
So the child lining up toys isn't acting out. They are essentially running an experiment to make sense of a chaotic world.
They're building a predictable model of reality. But because of this intense focus on systems rather than social pleasantries, society jumps to deeply damaging conclusions.
Which leads us to one of the most pervasive myths in the sources, the idea that autistic individuals simply lack empathy.
Oh, it's a massive misconception. It stems from neurotypical people fundamentally misunderstanding how different types of empathy function.
Indeed. The clinical literature dismantles this by dividing empathy into two entirely separate neurological functions, cognitive empathy and affective empathy.
And like most people go their whole lives without realizing those are two very different psychological mechanisms.
Cognitive empathy is essentially data collection. It is the ability to read the room, pick up on subtle social cues, and decipher unspoken intentions.
Affective empathy, on the other hand, is the emotional response to that data. It's the part of you that genuinely hurts when you see someone else suffering.
To illustrate the difference, look at the psychological profile of a psychopath. They possess near-perfect cognitive empathy.
Which is, terrifying because that is exactly how they manipulate people so effectively. They can read your mind, but they have zero effective empathy for your pain.
Autistic people generally have the exact opposite profile. They might struggle to instinctively read neurotypical social signals.
Like a subtle frown or a sarcastic tone might completely bypass them.
But once they realize someone is in distress, their active empathy is fierce. They are deeply loyal and often operate with a strictly unshakable moral code.
They care immensely about others. They just miss the specific neurotypical broadcast frequencies of the person sitting across from them.
Which perfectly introduces the double empathy problem. For decades, psychology treated autism as a one-sided failure to communicate.
Right, we always assumed autistic people just couldn't grasp the neurotypical world.
But this concept flips that entirely. It isn't a one-way deficit. The neurotypical world equally fails to understand the autistic perspective.
It's a two-way, cross-cultural communication breakdown.
But because neurotypical people make up the vast majority, their communication style is the enforced default.
And the autistic child is invariably the one penalized, isolated, and labeled as the problem.
If exploring these cross-cultural mental divides is giving you a few aha moments, take a second to like and subscribe. It helps us keep unpacking these deep dives for you.
We really have to look at the psychological toll that enforced default takes on autistic individuals. Because society demands neurotypical behavior, autistic people are forced into masking.
Masking or camouflaging, meaning they spend an extraordinary amount of daily energy actively pretending to be neurotypical.
Right. It requires consciously forcing eye contact, which can feel physically threatening, and constantly monitoring every single bodily movement.
It also involves actively suppressing the urge to stim. For those unfamiliar, stimming refers to self-regulating behaviors like hand flapping or rocking.
And those behaviors are crucial for managing sensory overload. When you force someone to suppress their natural regulatory tools, the psychological drain is just devastating.
The data shows this constant camouflaging is a direct pipeline to severe burnout, clinical depression, and long-term trauma.
And tragically, the clinical establishment didn't just ignore this trauma. Historically, early treatments actively demanded masking.
We are stepping into a rather massive clinical controversy here, specifically regarding early applied behavior analysis, or ABA.
Because for decades, these therapies were deeply rooted in the medical model of disability, which views the individual as inherently broken.
The overarching goal of early ABA wasn't necessarily to improve the child's internal well-being. The objective was strict behavioral compliance.
Right. Practitioners used intense operant conditioning, often involving up to 40 hours a week of relentless drills.
It was heavily based on the same principles used in animal training. They punished non-compliant behaviors and heavily rewarded enforced eye contact.
The entire focus was just making the child appear indistinguishable from their peers.
It's centered entirely on making neurotypical parents and teachers more comfortable. The internal psychological experience of the autistic child was completely disregarded.
You're effectively teaching a developing brain that its natural neurological reality is repulsive and must be hidden at all costs.
That conditioning leads directly to the massive rates of PTSD we see in autistic adults who were subjected to early intensive interventions.
I'm glad we can agree on the harm of the historical medical model, at least.
Oh, certainly. Prioritizing societal passing over a child's internal psychological health is demonstrably destructive, regardless of whether autism is an evolutionary trait or a genomic trade-off.
And this realization is exactly why the modern neurodiversity movement pushes so aggressively for strengths-based approaches today.
Shifting the burden of adaptation away from the individual child.
Yes, instead of pathologizing the child and forcing them to change their neurology, society needs to adjust the physical environment.
Meaning we should be designing classrooms and workplaces that don't rely on overwhelming sensory input and rigid, unspoken social hierarchies.
Exactly. If we create environments that actually fit different types of brains, the perceived deficits often disappear entirely.
It requires a profound shift in how we view human capability. The very traits we actively penalize in classrooms today are the exact traits that drove our species forward.
The hyper-focus, the rigid systemizing, the absolute resistance to distraction, these were the engines of early human innovation.
Which leaves you with a critical question to mull over. If human evolution relied so heavily on neurodivergence to advance our species, what future innovations are we currently stifling?
Yeah, when we force everyone to sit in the same rows and think the exact same way, we might be actively suppressing the highly specialized minds we need most.
It's quite a lot to think about.
Autism isn't about being less capable. It's about being different in how someone experiences and responds to the world. Understanding that difference can change how we teach, parent, and connect.
If this made you think a little differently, don't forget to like and subscribe.
Thanks for listening.